The 1970s were supposed to be the funeral, the final chapter, the decade that killed the American muscle car and buried it under a mountain of emissions regulations, insurance premiums, and fuel economy standards. But before the lights went out completely, there was one last explosion of power. One final burst of fury that proved horsepower wasn't ready to die quietly. The early 70s produced some of the most dangerous, most powerful, and most unhinged machines ever to wear American badges. These weren't the refined performance cars of today. They were raw, violent, and willing to kill you if you made a mistake. Today, we're counting down 16 deadliest 70s muscle cars ever made. The last warriors of a dying era that refused to surrender without a fight. Number 16, the 1970 Am Rebel machine. American Motors didn't have the budget of the big three, but they had something more valuable: the willingness to build something absolutely insane to get attention. The Rebel machine was AMC's middle finger to anyone who thought they couldn't compete in the muscle car wars. It came dressed in red, white, and blue paint with a massive hood scoop that looked like it belonged on a dragster, not a mid-sized sedan. Under that ridiculous scoop sat AMC's 390 cubic inch V8, which made 340 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque. That might not sound like much compared to the big block monsters from Chrysler and GM, but the machine weighed under 3,500 pounds, which gave it a power-to-weight ratio that made it genuinely quick. The quarter mile came in around 14.5 seconds at over 95 miles per hour, which was respectable for the era. But what made the machine deadly wasn't just the power, it was the handling, or lack thereof. AMC's suspension tuning was primitive compared to the competition. The steering was vague and slow. The brakes were marginal at best, and the chassis was built for comfort, not performance. The result was a car that could accelerate hard in a straight line, but became genuinely frightening when asked to do anything else. Turn into a corner with any enthusiasm, and the front end would plow straight ahead, ignoring your steering inputs. Lift off the throttle mid-corner, and the rear end would step out violently as weight transferred forward. The machine also suffered from terrible weight distribution, with the heavy V8 sitting far forward in the chassis. That made the car nose-heavy and prone to understeer. But punch the throttle, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose, and you'd be fighting to keep the car pointed in the right direction. Only about 2,000 machines were built, which made them rare, even when new. Today, they're collector's items. But back in 1970, they were just cheap muscle cars that could surprise unwary drivers with their willingness to bite. Number 15, the 1971 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler, 429. Mercury's muscle car offerings were often overlooked next to their Ford cousins, but the Cyclone Spoiler was a serious performance machine. The 429 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8 made 370 horsepower officially, but like all Ford big blocks of the era, that number was conservative. Real output was closer to 420 horses, with torque numbers that exceeded 450 pound-feet. The Cyclone could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. Those were impressive numbers, but they came with consequences. The Cyclone was heavy, nearly 3,900 pounds, which meant it had serious momentum once it got moving. Changing direction required planning and commitment, because the steering was slow and the suspension was tuned more for high-speed stability than cornering agility. The car was built for NASCAR homologation, which meant the aerodynamics were optimized for oval track racing, not drag strips or canyon roads. The long hood and short deck proportions meant forward visibility was compromised, especially when the front end lifted under hard acceleration, and the brakes were barely adequate for normal driving, let alone for repeatedly hauling this beast down from triple-digit speeds. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant problem during hard launches. Get on the power too aggressively, and the rear end would skip and bounce, breaking traction and sending the car sideways. The Cyclone demanded respect and smooth inputs. Treat it gently, and it would reward you with effortless power and comfortable cruising. Provoke it, and it would remind you that this was a car from an era when safety was optional and survival depended on skill. Number 14. The 1970 Oldsmobile 442 W30. Oldsmobile had been building performance cars since the early 60s, and by 1970 they'd refined the formula to near perfection. The 442 W30 package combined the 455 cubic inch V8 with upgraded suspension, functional hood scoops, and enough torque to light up the rear tires from a standstill. The engine made 365 horsepower officially, but that torque figure, 395 pound-feet, was what made the W30 dangerous. The power delivery was smooth and linear until you buried the throttle. Then, it transformed into something violent, with a surge of acceleration that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. The quarter mile came in around 13.5 seconds, at over 100 miles per hour. But the W30's real danger came from its refinement. It didn't feel like a wild muscle car. The interior was plush, the ride was comfortable, and the engine was smooth at cruising speeds. That civilized demeanor could lull you into a false sense of security. Then you'd put your foot down, the rear end would break loose, and you'd suddenly remember that this was still a car with nearly 400 pound-feet of torque and mediocre tires. The chassis was typical GMA body, competent, but not exceptional. The steering was slow and offered little feedback. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than handling, and the brakes were adequate at best. The W30 package added some stiffer springs and better shocks, but it couldn't overcome the basic limitations of a platform designed for cruising, not carving corners. What made it deadly was the disconnect between how it felt and what it could do. Most muscle cars announced their intentions with rough idles and stiff suspensions. The W30 felt like a luxury car right up until you asked for full power. Then it reminded you that sophistication and safety weren't the same thing. Number 13. The 1970 Plymouth GTX 440+6. Plymouth's GTX had been around since the late 60s, but the 1970 version with the 440+6 engine represented the peak of B-body muscle. The name came from the 3 two-barrel carburetors that sat atop 490 cubic inches of Mopar Fury. The engine made 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to propel the 3,700-pound GTX through the quarter mile in the mid-13s. But the real story was the power delivery. Those 3 carburetors created a progressive throttle response, docile at part throttle when only the center carburetor was working, violent at full throttle when all 3 kicked in. That transition could be abrupt and unpredictable. You'd be cruising along peacefully, then roll into the throttle mid-corner, and suddenly the outboard carburetors would open and you'd have way more power than traction. The rear end would step out, the car would rotate, and you'd be fighting to keep it pointed straight. The GTX's size and weight made it stable at high speeds, but difficult to maneuver in tight situations. The steering was slow, nearly 5 turns lock to lock, which meant you had to anticipate corners and turn in early. Wait too long, and you'd understeer straight into whatever was on the outside of the turn. The brakes were better than some muscle cars of the era, especially with the optional front discs, but they still struggled with fade during hard use. The suspension used Chrysler's torsion bar front end, which was more sophisticated than coil springs, but still couldn't overcome the basic physics of a nose-heavy rear-drive car with marginal tires. The GTX was a gentleman's muscle car, refined, comfortable, and capable of genuine violence when provoked. It proved that you could build a car that was both civilized and dangerous, a machine that would cruise comfortably all day and then terrify you the moment you asked for full power. Number 12. The 1971 Pontiac GTO Judge 455 HO. The Judge had been Pontiac's wildest GTO since 1969, and the 1971 version with the 455 HO engine was the final, furious expression of that philosophy. The styling was deliberately outrageous. Bright colors, bold graphics, and a massive rear wing that looked like it belonged on a race car. But that aggressive appearance couldn't hide the fact that the chassis was struggling to contain all that power. The 455 cubic inch V8 made 335 horsepower by the new SAE net ratings. which measured power with all accessories and exhaust restrictions in place. But the real output was significantly higher, closer to 400 horses by the old gross rating system. More importantly, the torque was massive, 480 pound-feet, that arrived low in the rev range and stayed strong all the way to redline. The Judge could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in around 6 seconds, but it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply couldn't be denied. Once this car got moving, it wanted to keep moving in a straight line. The steering was slow and vague, typical of Pontiac's A-body platform, and the suspension was soft enough that body roll was dramatic in any kind of spirited driving. The brakes were marginal, especially for a car this heavy and this fast. Fade set in quickly during hard use, and stopping distances grew longer, just when you needed them to be shorter. What made the Judge dangerous was the disconnect between its appearance and its actual capabilities. It looked like a race car, which made drivers believe it could handle like one. But the reality was far different. This was a straight-line brute that could get loose in a hurry if you pushed it in the corners. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration, and the rear end could step out violently if you got on the power too early coming out of a turn. Number 11. The 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS S454 LS6. This was the pinnacle, the absolute peak of Chevrolet muscle before everything came crashing down. The Chevelle SS with the LS 6454 cubic inch V8 was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, but everyone knew those numbers were lies. Conservative estimates put the real output closer to 500 horses, and dyno tests proved it. This engine was so powerful that Chevy only offered it for 1 year because it was too much, too brutal, too dangerous. The LS6 could propel the Chevelle from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds and through the quarter mile in the high 13s. Those were numbers that would still be respectable today, and this was 1970. But all that power came without any of the safety nets we take for granted now. No traction control, no stability management, no anti-lock brakes, just you, a steering wheel, and 500 horsepower trying to kill you. The Chevelle's chassis was competent for the era, but it wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. The rear suspension would squat under hard acceleration, loading the rear tires until they finally gave up and turned into smoke machines. The front end would lift, making steering light and vague right when you needed precision most, and the brakes, even with the optional front discs, were marginal at best for a car that could reach speeds where mistakes became catastrophic. What made the LS6 Chevelle truly dangerous was its accessibility. It looked like any other Chevelle on the road, which meant people underestimated it constantly. And that led to a lot of street races that ended badly, a lot of show-offs that ended in ditches, and a lot of legends about the car that was too powerful to survive. The LS6 engine featured forged internals, forged steel crankshaft, forged connecting rods, and forged aluminum pistons that could handle the stress of sustained, high RPM operation. The cylinder heads flowed massive amounts of air, and the camshaft profile was aggressive enough to make the engine idle rough and create significant overlap. The solid lifter valve train required regular adjustment, and the high compression ratio, 11.25 to 1, demanded premium fuel. This wasn't an engine you could neglect. It required maintenance, attention, and respect. Number 10. The 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. Buick wasn't known for building muscle cars, which made the GSX all the more shocking. This was Buick's declaration that they could build something just as brutal as anything from Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Chevrolet. The GSX came in wild colors, Apollo white and Saturn yellow, with bold stripes and graphics that announced this wasn't your grandfather's Buick. Under the hood sat the 455 cubic inch Stage 1 V8, which officially made 360 horsepower and 510 pound-feet of torque. That torque number was staggering. It was more than the Hemi, more than the LS6, more than anything else on American roads in 1970. And you felt every single pound-foot of it. The GSX could rip through the quarter mile in the high 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. But it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply refused to be denied. The steering was slow and vague, typical of GM's a body platform, and the brakes were marginal at best. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than performance, which meant body roll was dramatic in corners. But the real danger was that torque. Plant your foot and the GSX would squat on its rear suspension, load up those rear tires, and then launch forward with a violence that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. The rear end would step out under hard acceleration, and correcting it required quick hands and quicker thinking. The Stage 1 engine was built for low-end torque, which meant it pulled like a freight train from idle, but ran out of breath at higher RPM. The long stroke, 4.31 inches, created massive leverage on the crankshaft, which translated to that incredible torque output. But it also meant the engine couldn't rev as high as short-stroke competitors. Peak power came at 4,700 RPM, and the engine was done making power by 5,500. That narrow power band meant you had to shift carefully to keep the engine in its sweet spot. The automatic transmission was the only option, which meant you couldn't use a manual gearbox to control power delivery. The turbo hydromatic was strong enough to handle the torque, but it shifted slowly compared to modern automatics, and there was no manual control beyond holding gears with the shifter. Number 9, the 1974 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Superduty 455. By 1974, the muscle car era was supposed to be over, dead, buried under a mountain of emissions regulations and insurance premiums. But Pontiac had one last ace up their sleeve, the Superduty 455. This was a 7.5-liter monster that officially made 290 horsepower. But those were the new SAE net ratings that measured power with all accessories attached and exhaust restrictions in place. The reality was far more violent. The Superduty 455 was an honest-to-goodness race engine that Pontiac somehow convinced the EPA to let them sell to the public. It featured forged pistons, a high-lift cam, special heads with larger valves, and improved porting, and an attitude that said emissions regulations could go to hell. The intake manifold was a high-rise aluminum unit that improved top-end breathing. The exhaust manifolds were cast iron but designed to reduce back pressure, and the ignition system was upgraded to handle the stress of high-performance operation. Only around 1,000 were built, which made them instant legends. The Trans Am could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s, which was astonishing for a car built in the middle of the Malaise era. But it was also astonishing how willing this car was to swap ends on you. The Superduty's massive torque curve meant power was available everywhere, and that meant the rear tires were constantly on the edge of breaking loose. The chassis was the same as the standard Trans Am, which meant it wasn't really designed to handle this much thrust. The steering was slow, the suspension was soft, and the brakes were barely adequate. Get on the power mid-corner, and the rear end would step out so violently that only experienced drivers could catch it before the car was facing the wrong direction. The Superduty Trans Am was Pontiac's middle finger to everyone who said performance was dead, and it was glorious and terrifying in equal measure. The engine required premium fuel at a time when the gas crisis made premium hard to find and expensive to buy. Run regular unleaded, and the engine would ping and knock like it was trying to tear itself apart. The solid lifter cam meant valve adjustments every few thousand miles, and the Rochester Quadrajet carburetor was finicky at best. Number 8, the 1970 Plymouth Hemicuda. The Hemicuda was the stuff of legend even when it was new. Plymouth took their already aggressive Barracuda platform and stuffed it full of the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8, an engine so powerful it required its own hood with a massive scoop just to clear the air cleaner. The Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, but those numbers were as conservative as a church sermon. Real-world output was closer to 500 horses, and everyone knew it. The Hemicuda could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. That was supercar territory in 1970, and Plymouth did it with an engine that was essentially a race motor, with turn signals bolted to it. But the Hemicuda was dangerous precisely because it was so powerful. The chassis simply wasn't designed to handle this kind of output. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration. The front end would lift so high that steering became a suggestion rather than a command. and the brakes were woefully inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. Add in the fact that the Hemi required constant tuning. Those dual 4-barrel carburetors were temperamental at best, and you had a car that could stumble and surge at the worst possible moments. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased, with over 60% of the car's weight on the front axle. That made the car plow in corners until you lifted off the throttle. But lift mid-corner and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose, and you'd be fighting a drift whether you wanted one or not. The short wheelbase, 108 inches, made weight transfer dramatic and sudden. There was no gentle progression from grip to slip, just an instant transition that required lightning-fast reflexes to catch. Only about 650 Hemicudas were built in 1970, which made them rare even when new. Today they're worth millions, but back then they were just dangerous street cars that separated brave drivers from survivors. The Hemi engine was also expensive to maintain. It required specialized knowledge to tune properly, and parts were expensive even when new. The dual Carter AFB carburetors needed to be synchronized perfectly, and the mechanical lifters required regular valve adjustments. The cooling system was marginal at best, which meant the Hemi ran hot in traffic and could overheat if you weren't careful. Number 7, the 1971 Dodge Challenger RT4 406-pack. Dodge's pony car entry had always been bigger and more brutal than the competition, and the 1971 Challenger RT with the 446-pack was no exception. The engine used 3 2-barrel carburetors to feed 490 cubic inches of Mopar muscle. It made 385 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to make the 3,600-pound Challenger genuinely quick. The quarter mile came in the mid-13s, and 0 to 60 took around 6 seconds, but the power delivery was the real story. Those 3 carburetors created a progressive but unpredictable throttle response. At part throttle, only the center carburetor was working, and the car felt docile and manageable. But open it up and the outboard carburetors would kick in, and suddenly you'd have way more power than the chassis could handle. The rear end would break loose, the car would step sideways, and you'd be fighting to maintain control. The Challenger was also huge, over 110 inches in wheelbase, and nearly 16 feet long overall. That size made it stable at high speeds, but unwieldy in traffic or on tight roads. The steering was slow and heavy, requiring nearly 5 full turns lock to lock. The brakes were better than some competitors, especially if you had the optional front discs, but they still struggled with fade during repeated hard stops. And the weight distribution was heavily nose-forward, with that big wedge head engine sitting far ahead of the front axle. That made understeer a constant companion during spirited driving. The 6-pack induction system was also temperamental. The vacuum-operated valves that controlled the outboard carburetors could stick or leak, causing rough running and poor performance. The linkage required careful adjustment to ensure all 3 carburetors opened in sync, and the system was sensitive to fuel quality. Run low-octane gas, and the engine would ping and detonate under load. But when everything was working correctly, the 6-pack Challenger was a monster that could run with anything on the street. Number 6, the 1970 Chevrolet Corvette LS5 454. The Corvette had always been America's sports car, but the 1970 version with the LS5 454 engine was more muscle car than sports car. That massive 7.4-liter V8 made 390 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to propel the Corvette from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds. The quarter mile came in the high 30s. Those were impressive numbers, but they came with serious consequences. The Corvette's fiberglass body meant it was relatively light at around 3,300 pounds, but the chassis dynamics were primitive by modern standards. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased because of that massive engine, which meant understeer was a constant companion. Push hard into a corner and the front end would plow straight ahead, no matter how much you turned the steering wheel. But lift off the throttle mid-corner and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward, the rear tires would break loose, and you'd be in a drift whether you wanted one or not. The steering was quick but not particularly communicative, which meant you didn't always know what the front tires were doing until it was too late. The independent rear suspension was sophisticated for the era, but it could be unpredictable under hard use. Hit a bump mid-corner and the rear end could kick sideways without warning. The brakes were 4-wheel discs, which was better than most muscle cars of the era. but they still struggled with fade during hard use. What made the LS5 Corvette truly dangerous was its power-to-weight ratio. With nearly 400 horsepower and a relatively light chassis, this car could accelerate hard enough to surprise even experienced drivers. The rear end would break loose without much provocation, especially in the wet, and catching a slide required skill and quick reflexes. The Corvette attracted drivers who saw themselves as skilled enthusiasts, but the car had a way of exposing the difference between confidence and competence. The combination of serious power, primitive chassis dynamics, and a buyer demographic that sometimes valued image over ability led to a lot of crashed Corvettes. Number 5. The 1970 Ford Mustang Boss, 429. Ford's biggest mistake was also one of their most memorable muscle cars. The Boss 429 was created to dominate NASCAR, which required Ford to build a certain number of production versions to qualify for racing homologation. So, they took the Mustang's relatively compact body and shoehorned in Ford's biggest big block, the 429 cubic inch V8, that made 175 horsepower officially, but probably closer to 450 in reality. The result was a car that was breathtakingly fast in a straight line and absolutely terrifying everywhere else. The front end was so heavy that the Mustang handled like a freight train. Understeer was severe, and the steering was vague and slow. The front suspension was overwhelmed by the weight, causing the car to plow straight ahead in corners. And the weight distribution was so bad, nearly 65% on the front axle, that the car felt nose-heavy and unbalanced at all times. But punch the throttle and the Boss 429 would rocket forward with violence that took your breath away. The quarter mile came in the mid-13s, and 60 miles per hour arrived in under 6 seconds. The engine made its power at the top of the rev range, which meant you had to rev it hard to get maximum performance. But the solid lifter valve train made a mechanical racket that sounded like the engine was destroying itself. Only about 859 were built, which made them rare and valuable. But they were also difficult to drive and impossible to insure for most buyers. The Boss 429 represented Ford's commitment to winning races at any cost, even if that cost was building a car that was barely drivable on the street. Number 4. The 1970 Dodge Coronet RT Hemi. Dodge's full-size muscle car entry was often overlooked next to the more famous Charger and Challenger. But the Coronet RT with the Hemi engine was every bit as dangerous. The 426 cubic inch Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, installed in a car that weighed nearly 3,800 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio wasn't as favorable as smaller cars, but the Coronet made up for it with brute force. The quarter mile came in the mid-13s, and the acceleration from a rolling start was simply devastating. The Hemi's massive torque meant the car could pull like a freight train from any speed, but the Coronet's size and weight made it difficult to control at the limit. The steering was slow and vague, the brakes were marginal, and the suspension was tuned for comfort rather than performance. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant problem during hard acceleration. The long wheelbase, 117 inches, helped with straight-line stability, but made the car feel ponderous in corners. What made the Coronet Hemi truly dangerous was its relative anonymity. It looked like any other full-size Dodge sedan, which meant people constantly underestimated it. And when the driver of that ordinary-looking sedan stomped on the throttle and those dual 4-barrel carburetors opened up, the results were often catastrophic for whoever was unfortunate enough to be racing against it. The Hemi Coronet was a sleeper in the truest sense, a car that looked boring but performed like a race car. Number 3. The 1971 Ford Mustang Boss 351. The Boss 351 was Ford's high-revving answer to the Chevrolet Z28 and Pontiac Trans Am. It featured a cleverly disguised 351 cubic inch V8, created by destroying the blocks and putting together the largest small block Ford could build. That made 330 horsepower, officially but probably 400 horses in reality. The engine could rev to 7,000 RPM, which was unheard of for a big displacement American V8. The Boss 351 could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 14 seconds. But what made it dangerous was its Jekyll and Hyde personality. Drive it normally and it felt docile, with smooth power delivery and reasonable handling, but push it hard and it transformed into something wild. The high-revving engine encouraged aggressive driving, and the suspension was stiff enough to handle spirited cornering. But the rear end could break loose suddenly and violently if you pushed too hard, and the brakes were marginal for sustained hard use. The Boss 351 was a car that rewarded skill and punished mistakes, and it attracted drivers who sometimes had more enthusiasm than ability. Number 2, the 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner 440+6. Plymouth's cartoon-themed muscle car was never subtle, and the 1970 version with the 440+6 engine was the most extreme expression of that philosophy. 3 two-barrel carburetors fed 490 cubic inches of angry V8, creating 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. The Roadrunner could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. But it weighed over 3,700 pounds, and that weight came with consequences. The chassis was never designed for this much power, and it showed. The steering was slow and vague, the brakes were barely adequate, and the suspension allowed massive body roll in corners. The power delivery from those 3 carburetors was unpredictable. Docile at part throttle, violent when all 3 opened up, get on the power mid-corner, and the rear end would step out so quickly that only experienced drivers could catch it. The Roadrunner was a straight-line weapon that could embarrass almost anything at a stoplight, but became genuinely dangerous when asked to turn or stop. Number 1, the 1970 Plymouth Hemicuda convertible. At the top of our list sits the rarest, most dangerous, and most valuable muscle car of the 1970s, the Hemicuda convertible. Only 7 of these were built in 1970, which makes them unicorns today. But back then, they were just insanely powerful convertibles that could kill you if you didn't respect what you were sitting in. Under the hood sat the legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi 5.8, making 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers were fiction. Real output was closer to 500 horses, and the Hemi's torque curve was as flat and brutal as a baseball bat to the head. The Hemicuda convertible could run the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today. And this was 1970, with bias-ply tires and no electronic aids whatsoever. But add in the fact that this was a convertible, which meant the chassis had less structural rigidity than the hardtop, and you had a recipe for disaster. The body would flex under hard acceleration or during aggressive cornering, which made the handling even more unpredictable than it already was. The steering was vague, the suspension was overwhelmed, and the brakes were laughably inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. The Hemi engine required constant attention. Those dual 4-barrel carburetors needed regular tuning, and when they weren't perfectly synchronized, the engine would stumble and surge. That unpredictability was dangerous when you were already trying to manage 500 horsepower through tires that had maybe half the grip of modern rubber. The convertible top also meant visibility was compromised when it was up, and wind buffeting was severe when it was down at high speeds. What made the Hemicuda convertible the most dangerous muscle car of the 70s was the combination of insane power, compromised structure, primitive chassis dynamics, and absolute rarity. These cars were so expensive and so rare that most owners didn't drive them hard enough to learn their limits, and when they did, the results were often catastrophic. The Hemicuda convertible represented the absolute peak of American muscle. Powerful, beautiful, rare, and willing to kill you without a moment's hesitation if you made a mistake. Today, they're worth millions and sit in climate-controlled garages, but back in 1970, they were street-legal race cars that demanded respect and punished anything less. These 16 machines represented the last hurrah of an era that would never come again. They were built in a time when power mattered more than safety, when performance trumped practicality, and when danger was just part of the package. The insurance companies feared them, the government tried to kill them, and drivers either mastered them or learned painful lessons about the limits of their own abilities. These weren't cars. They were challenges wrapped in steel and chrome, daring you to prove you were worthy. The 1970s saw the beginning of the end, but before the darkness came, These machines burned brighter than ever. They represented everything that was wild, dangerous, and magnificent about American automotive culture. Which of these 70s legends would you be brave enough to drive hard? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories from the decade when muscle cars made their final stand, hit that subscribe button for more automotive history that refuses to be forgotten.